Hello from the past. I'm Sarah Miner, and this talk is called Space is Time, and it's part of the Fall 2020 Creative Writing Studies Conference hosted by Ohio Northern University. Hello to many of you who I will never hear or see. It's 7 a.m., and I'm glad to have you with me, even for just this moment before the traffic starts to moan, or the baby wakes, or the bells on your email start tolling. Perhaps they are already tolling whenever you are. As a writer, I often find that I am speaking from a past to a future in an effort to capture something only possible through a delicate presence. I'm lucky to be beaming to you today as part of a virtual writing conference, one of the first of its kind, on the theme of creative writing in liminal spaces. Like the stair landing where I am sitting, a liminal space is a place stretching between two entities we think of as distinct. In recent years, the term liminal space has been Googled so often and appeared with so much abandon in the titles of academic articles that it has become something of a meme in the wider society of the internet. On Twitter, a signed cowgal writes, "Academics be like, I know a spot, and then take you to a liminal space." There is now a liminal space society that gathers on Facebook, and in one version of the famous butterfly meme, the speaker asks us, "Is this a liminal space?" gesturing at the Blackboard logo. It is a great pleasure and indeed a tool of the people to make jokes about language at the expense of power. But liminal's memification has also allowed the word to move beyond the limits of academia and into the space of culture, where often the fervor around new language signals a moment of co-opting, and then the final release of something that was, in stuffier rooms, hard to say. The writer Arnold van Gennep, who coined the term liminal, talked about it only in the context of community, as a ritual or rite of passage in small-scale society. This year, the virus has sat each of us down in the shared waiting room of private and planetary grief, without our next steps in sight. Because space is time, these months have left many writers without language, as we risk either sitting still too long in our homes or marching among each other for too long in the streets. Passage is the word I borrow from Van Gennep because it seems now that the thing about a liminal space is that you are right there up until you are not anymore. I am speaking to you from a time when all we are sure of is that a future is coming. And what will it have meant for us to write from a space called liminal? During other moments in my life, when I have felt exceptionally lost, I've spent whole days in the public library, a space that feels somewhere between public and private, spending my time reading and browsing and looking at microfiche and taking notes and watching other patrons and eating and napping and sitting on the thin carpet between great stacks of books with my back pressed against one bookshelf and the soles of my feet pressed against another. I know that half of me is exactly as long as the space between most bookshelves, and that library haunting was the way I first trained myself to study and then to write, before I ever thought of myself as a writer. It was 9 years ago, in one of those weird days that turned into nights in a library, that I came across the word liminal, which was brand new to me, but had already spread across fields and into the lexicon of many people who are writers. Today, when someone says liminal space sincerely, they are often using it to explain something that remains beyond the reach of other terms. Sometimes when people invoke liminal, they mean something like collaborative, or fleeting, or queer, or decolonial, or anti-hierarchical. The lie of whiteness, of course, is that it is possible for a state of being to not be liminal, and in all of its current usages, liminal space seems an attempt at avoiding the use of a negative to explain a real experience. For me, writing from the liminal means to write from a position of suspension, which is altogether different than a position of suspense. Since March, I have gotten to know my house and my 3 house cats very well. A good thing about house cats is that they are not very tall. A bad thing about house cats is that they are keen to learn what competes for your love with them, and then to destroy it. Books are the second smallest thing that I love, and so I live with a cat who chews the edges of books for attention. The empty margins of these pages, which my cat sometimes digests and regurgitates, were initially designed because of the once common household problem of rats gnawing away the edges of books, made sweet by the ink and treated leather there. It used to be that the more important the content of the book, the wider the margins, to protect against rodent and flood. Now the trusty white frames of every page have become an aesthetic we expect. In a medium where even our margins are standardized, what could it mean to write in a liminal space? In her introduction to the 2nd edition of Sister Outsider, the poet and scholar of the Black arts movement, Cheryl Clark, describes Audre Lorde by writing, "Were she here among us in the funky US, instead of floating somewhere over the Guinea coast, Lorde would still want and have to claim that outsider stance." These prose works, much like her poetry, position her and us, as Akasha Gloria Hull said many years ago, on the line, refusing the safety of that inside perimeter. Writing in the lineage of Audre Lorde, the lyric essayist and organizer Jen Soriano has used the term intersectional form after Kimberly Crenshaw's Intersectional to describe examples of writing that breaks away from the confines of traditional narrative arc and instead moves through fragments and strands and strips, conveying multiple viewpoints to reject homogeneous truth in favor of a more complex reality. Soriano writes, "If essays are a simulation of the mind working its way through a problem, then intersectional form allows for a more authentic simulation of the workings of marginalized minds, wrestling with the power and gifted with multiple perspectives from the margin." Looking at Lorde's and Soriano's work together through the framework of the liminal, we see how writers who make work that reflects a between or an outsider state are doing so by reenacting the roles they play in their own lives on their pages. In writing from a place of social margin and to the strict confines of the page, writers are using the skills they have gained in lived experiences of translation and communication. And it is these very gestures that move many to experiment further within the physical form of their writing. In intersectional forms, as Soriano calls them, the fragmented form of the text becomes a tool for reflecting the nuanced perspectives only available from those interstitial seats, poised in between. Elsewhere, in a performance piece called In Balance, the visual artist and curator Courtney Kessel sits on the long end of a wooden seesaw in a gallery and physically balances her daughter and a stack of her daughter's toys on the opposite end of the seesaw. Throughout the performance, Kessel stacks one item after another on her daughter's end of the saw until the two of them reach perfect suspension. In the space of a gallery, the audience watches Kessel expressing an experience of time by filling up space. Kessel writes about her piece through the framework of a practice of interruption, what she describes as the work of artist mothers who are not afforded the long stretches of solitude we often imagine the writer or artist requires, and that their work is made instead in the moments that slip between acts of support for others. When looking at Kessel's work, I noticed that whenever a person makes art from the position of counterweight, or what we writers could call a poetics of interruption, the artist themselves becomes momentarily suspended. In work that comes out of such practices, writers are able to communicate the mind working its way through a problem in a manner that reflects the suspension of a single thought across multiple days, actions, and roles. Whenever we invoke a liminal space, we are always, in every instance, talking about an experience of doubles or multiplicity. In her Cyborg Manifesto, Donna Haraway describes the spaces of duality that arise in the combination of a machine and an organism. Haraway explains that a cyborg's consciousness is an example of a state we might call liminal because it is both but neither. And importantly, that the thing that is in between is explicitly invisible to us because we cannot describe it in the terms we currently have. So what Haraway tells us is that whenever something is liminal, it often goes undescribed and therefore also goes unseen. On the written page, I tell my students space is time because if there is enough of it, empty space becomes a rest for the reader's eyes and acts as an invitation for collaboration by offering, rather than a description, a field where the reader's own thinking can take shape. The demilitarized zone, known as the DMZ, is an uninhabited section of land marking the passage between North and South Korea. The boundaries of the zone are marked, perhaps ironically, by extreme military presence, miles of metal fencing, and morning target practices that have resulted in a nature preserve with some of the firmest protections on the planet. In 2010, as I stood there with a group of students staring into the fog that spread north, we were told that the Asiatic black bears and tigers who lived there might be adapting to avoid landmines, and that conservationists worried that peace between the two countries could someday disrupt their habitat. Because on the page, narrative time continues moving in the empty space at the same pace that it moves in sections of text, an open space in a piece of writing can signal silence or time passing, and in doing so, allows the mind of the reader to pass time instead. As a writer of experimental forms, I am especially interested in types of writing that involve this intentional kind of vacancy, spaces that ask the reader to remain for a moment suspended. I am interested in the ways a text physical form can have a hand in communicating experiences that are hard to describe through blocks of text alone. What I am saying is that if there is a liminal approach to writing from a place of suspension, it may be somewhere in the translational, interstitial work of writing across gaps, and also between types of media. The image above is of an ROFL copter, or a rafflecopter. This copter is an example of ASCII art born of the early internet age, a time when users began to create and share images made from the characters available inside text boxes, and in doing so developed new forms of communication and insider vocabulary. In the online culture of multi-user chat rooms, the rafflecopter was a visual feat and also a form of slang that reanimated abbreviations like LOL, ROFL, and LMAO, which users had started to repeat and extend in examples like LOLOLOL or LOLROFL, LOLROFL. so often that people had started to get bored, and the acronyms began to lose their meaning. The advent of the rafflecopter made communication of the same hyperbolic expressions both faster and more visual, while recalling the sound of a helicopter and the emphatic palindrome-like abbreviations native to the chat box era. By imagining the sound of a helicopter hovering, suspended, combined with the sound of typing LOLOL, even a reader who was not alive during the ASCII age might notice how, in a time before the iPhone camera and the emoji, an image like the rafflecopter could be used either to affirm and include a member of a large group chat, or to exclude and make fun of a member who was not welcome in a group whose identity depended on specialized language. As artists of limitations, some of these chatters surely went on to become poets. About the minimal visual forms in her work, Lakotan poet Layli Longsoldier says the shape comes first, and that later content is pulled into form. The first poem in Layli Longsoldier's book, Whereas, entitled Hesapa, addresses the story of a relative in Longsoldier's family who was killed by being dragged behind a truck. One stanza of the poem takes the form of a square made by 4 lines of the same language in 4 different arrangements. When I first read Hesapa, I was immediately reminded that the translation of the word stanza is room, which explains why most poets can't forget that on the page, space is time, though here Longsoldier is also accomplishing much more. Hesapa is the name of the landscape Longsoldier comes from, and in this context we can see how the shape inside the poem presents not a vacant space to be occupied, but a plot of land that exists independent of ownership, and draws the reader's attention to the limitations dominant power structures may be placing on Longsoldier, even as they read this poem. This is how you see me in the place in which to place me. The space in me you see is this place. To see this space, see how you place me in you. This is how to place you in the space in which to see. With each reshuffled line, Longsoldier establishes this shape as both the violent limitations on a group of people and a place to sit inside the book alongside Longsoldier in an act of remaking. When space and time are paralleled in this manner, through a progression that feels like opening a folded fan, the poem also offers, perhaps, that the acknowledgement of violence can make way for new visions of autonomy. Outside the realms of poetry, writers of prose have also approached writing across and into the space of the page as a way to write from the liminal. In Jennifer Wortman's essay, Worst Case Scenario, Wortman describes the time her husband fell 35 feet down a large gap between 2 rocks while climbing. Because her husband had studied worst-case scenarios from a handbook with the same title, he survived the fall by turning his body into the shape of a V and landing on his sacrum. A human body falling through the air sacrum down makes the shape of a bird in flight, almost the cartoon shape. It's the animal that Wortman's husband said he would like to return as, the shape of his afterlife. In her essay, Wortman has drawn this V shape for the reader in the shape between the 2 rocks of text that the word case is suspended between, hanging in the moment before her husband's fate was realized. If we imagine that the word case is the body falling slow motion between rocks, then that body is actually falling upright, the wrong way. It is a body experiencing the worst case scenario, not contorting itself according to the handbook. Wortman could have made this suspended word body or husband, but she chose case, as if the writer is presently imagining what would have happened had her husband fallen the way case is shaped. Because the form of this essay doesn't reiterate the story it contains, the piece emphasizes the sense that Wortman's husband might not have survived that fall, by depicting the moment in which no one knew. Here, space is used to offer the reader time to consider the layered implications that might not be explicit in the text itself. Thankfully, Wortman's husband never did become a bird, but his body did fly through the air shortly after this fall in a helicopter. Because space is time, here I am, someone I used to be, writing to the person who you aren't quite yet, describing a type of writing that cannot be named by genre, a kind of writing that is more like a passage, more like a practice of attention, a position of hanging mid-air in suspension activated by the space of a page. These tools are not new by any means. The video narrative, the concrete poem, the typographic tale, and the visual essay are all forms that writers use to communicate across space and between two mediums. And in doing so, they can demonstrate for the audience the ways writers act as translators between factions we have easy language to describe. If writing into a liminal space means to write from the place of neither nor, from between death and flight, between the college and the summer job, between border and center, binary and continuum, between the kitchen vinyl and the cubicle wall, between whiteness and everyone it tries to keep out, then liminal writing is also a practice of rejecting traditional forms of closure, of rejecting the notion that closure is a lived experience of all readers, of rejecting even that closure is the thing the reader has come for at all. The library where I sat all night on the floor between bookshelves was at a university where I took my first and only class with the writer Fenton Johnson, who said, at least 4 times that semester, "I do declare I do not believe in time." I agreed with him then, and I know now that time is also controlled by perception, as we know that human attention can change even the shapes of cells. For me, the ubiquity of liminal spaces in the form of search terms, memes, and conference papers is not a signal that this term is dead or out of use, but that it flags a type of experience many are still seeking to describe. By following the path of these writers, and by employing some experimental forms, writers might better describe the days or years we later call passage. Neither or nor, interstitial, interrupted, waiting room, suspended, liminal, between. Thank you.